Welcome back, everyone. Let's get right into it. Today's explainer is tackling a pretty intense and highly specific vision of America's political future. We're going to be unpacking the arguments and theories from a book that attempts to diagnose the post-2024 election landscape. So let's dive right in. Today, we are examining The Day After, How to Wield Power in a Post-Trump World by Brian Tyler Cohen. Now, just to be clear right up front, my role here is to be your impartial guide. We're going to be looking strictly at Cohen's diagnosis of the American government following the 2024 election, and we'll break down his proposed roadmap for structural reform. Whether you're a political junkie or just want a clear, structured look at exactly what this author is proposing, this explainer is designed to lay it all out for you, straight from the source. To understand Cohen's problem and solution framework, here is our agenda. We'll start with the post-2024 landscape, followed by media and institutional collapse. Then, we'll look ahead to the 2029 crossroads, unpack a roadmap for reform, and finally, look at the 4 stages of recovery. Starting off with Part 1, the post-2024 landscape. Right out of the gate, the foundation of the book's argument is captured in its foreword by Mark Elias. He writes, "Our goals should be the transformation of our institutions, not merely their restoration." And this is absolutely crucial to Cohen's entire premise. The author argues that the pro-democracy movement has to completely abandon this idea of just going back to a pre-2016 or pre-2024 normal. Simply being the resistance is too reactive. Instead, the book claims that the only actual way forward is a total structural transformation, tearing down the old ways and replacing them with something much bolder. So, why the need for such a massive transformation? Well, Cohen lays out a pretty stark diagnosis to justify it. He outlines several areas where he claims democratic guardrails have totally broken down. First, he points to what he sees as a collapse of governmental checks, arguing that congressional Republicans are acting more like facilitators than a co-equal branch doing oversight. He also flags the push for unitary executive power, basically a really expansive autocratic view of what a president can do. Add in the overt politicization of federal workers, like vetting staff for ideological loyalty, which he ties straight to proposals like Project 2025, and what he calls the loss of independence at the Justice Department. Whether you agree with the politics or not, Cohen's core argument here is that the fundamental rule of law has been deeply altered. Which brings us to Part 2, Media and Institutional Collapse. Cohen drops this line in the text, "Under Trump's second coming, the foxification of the media has accelerated." Now, the argument he's making is that democracies don't just fall off a cliff out of nowhere, they get pushed. And when the legislature and courts lose their independence, the media is supposed to be that last surviving check. But Cohen contends that corporate media owners are actually folding under pressure. He claims they're caving to coercion and nuisance lawsuits, and instead of holding power accountable, these corporations are settling bogus claims and turning their networks into compliant echo chambers. To back this up, the author brings in a very specific, high-profile example involving Jeff Bezos, The Washington Post, and Amazon. Cohen points out that shortly after the 2024 election, The Washington Post completely scrapped its opinion section, supposedly to avoid the perception of bias. But the book argues this decision wasn't about journalistic integrity at all. It was deeply tied to corporate interests. And here is the number Cohen uses to anchor that claim: $20 billion. That is the estimated value of Amazon Web Services' national security contracts with the federal government. To put that into perspective, that is a massive amount of leverage. Cohen poses a question: why would a savvy businessman alienate his own newspaper's readers? His answer is that the business model of a newspaper matters way less than protecting $20 billion in federal contracts. He presents this as the ultimate example of private institutions caving in. Let's move to Part 3, the 2029 crossroads. Having laid out all these problems, the author does this really fascinating narrative shift in the prologue. He imagines a hypothetical scenario in January 2029 where a newly elected 48th Democratic president is taking office after a second Trump term, and inside the White House, there's a massive turf war between 2 rival factions of advisors. On one side, you've got the Washington veterans. These are the establishment folks who just want to heal the fractured nation and get back to the old normal of Washington politics. But on the other side, you have the insurgent upstarts. They completely reject the status quo. They argue that trying to rewind the clock is a naive mistake, and instead, they want to build a completely new fortress of democracy that future movements can't destroy. The book frames this exact ideological split as the defining battle for America's future. So, how do they build that fortress? That takes us to Part 4, a roadmap for reform. This is where Cohen moves from diagnosing the problem to prescribing the cure. And he goes big. He lays out a series of sweeping structural changes that he insists are absolutely necessary to stop the country from sliding into terminal decline. First up, establishing a strict, enforceable Supreme Court code of conduct. Next, ending the Senate filibuster so legislation can actually get passed. He also demands curbing the imperial presidency to get constitutional checks and balances working again, especially after recent Supreme Court rulings on presidential immunity. And then, interestingly, he throws in something you might not expect in a book about democratic procedure, implementing Medicare for all. Now, you might be wondering if any of this is actually feasible. To back up the Supreme Court reform, Cohen cites a 2024 USA Today poll, and the data is pretty wild. A massive 76% of Americans support a binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court. The book argues that this new panel should actually have the teeth to force justices to recuse themselves if they have personal ties to a case, or even remove them for bad conduct. So he's using this data to say, hey, these reforms aren't just necessary, they're incredibly popular. But let's circle back to that Medicare for all point. Why is healthcare sitting in the middle of a political reform roadmap? Well, Cohen argues that you literally cannot separate the health of a democracy from the physical and financial health of its citizens. He brings in a study from The Lancet claiming that Medicare for All wouldn't just save more than 68,000 lives every year, it would also save roughly $450 billion annually in administrative costs alone. The core argument here is that if leaders fail to deliver an economy and a healthcare system that actually works for everyday people, they are going to lose the trust they need to govern in the first place. Finally, we hit Part 5, 4 stages of recovery. So how does the country actually execute this massive roadmap? Drawing from the book's epilogue, Cohen lays out a literal, actionable blueprint for a post-Trump America, broken down into 4 exact stages. Step 1, admit failure. You have to stop the denial and recognize that the system is broken past the tipping point. Step 2, inventory those failures. This means getting brutally honest about the root causes, and Cohen makes a point to call out not just the outright enemies of democracy, but the complacent friends of democracy who were just too scared to act. Step 3, seek accountability. The book stresses that no reform happens without a real reckoning for the people who abused power. And Step 4, deliver results. Just like we talked about with healthcare, fixing the system only matters if it actually makes life better for everyday families and neighbors. Which leaves us with the ultimate question posed by the book's core premise. What comes the day after? Brian Tyler Cohen is presenting a scenario where the future of democratic institutions relies entirely on bold, unyielding transformation rather than just retreating to a comfortable past. It's a blueprint that demands superhuman political courage and totally refuses to accept the status quo. So, as you look at this proposed political landscape, you really have to ask yourself, when the dust finally settles on our current era, will the system simply patch its holes, or are we staring down a complete rebuild? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.